50 years ago, almost exactly, I came in here for the very first time as a young undergraduate. And I looked up there at the statue of the founder, Bishop Fox, Bishop of Winchester, and a very important man in early 16th century England, and immediately, like many others before and since, fell in love with this extraordinary, beautiful place. Bishop Fox's idea in the foundation of his college, almost exactly 500 years ago, was to establish as the core of the teaching at Corpus the ideas and writings of the ancients, writings which had been rediscovered in the Renaissance and which, through the invention of printing, had received European dissemination. This was a new world of ideas, which contributed to a new intellectual debate and to techniques of scholarship. Fox was no religious reformer, but in founding his new college of Corpus Christi, he created a place where his scholarly bees, as Erasmus was to call them, would be able to study the great works of the past across many disciplines in the three languages of scholarship, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. Since 1517, generations of fellows and benefactors have added to the great treasury of books given by the founder and by the first president, John Claymont, books both printed and manuscript, the earliest of the latter dating from the 9th century. These wonderful books serve as an intellectual magnet which today draws scholars from around the world. I've spent my life working with books and manuscripts, but it's a great joy to come back here where, in a sense, it all began. This remarkable library of some 70,000 volumes used on a daily basis by members of the college also houses great treasures. These treasures are, on the whole, not seen, and it is to those today that I wish to introduce you. Julian Reed is the Corpus Christi archivist. He is surrounded by the books and manuscripts that have helped to secure the library's reputation as a repository for some of the most important and rarest books of their type. Now, Julian, amongst the many wonderful manuscripts which are in the library at Corpus, most of which are, of course, of a very scholarly nature, there are a few that stand out for different reasons, and undoubtedly this extraordinarily beautiful French early 16th century Bible, or quasi-Bible, is outstanding. Can you tell us something about it and how it comes to be here?
One of our old members, James Oglethorpe, who was here in the early 18th century as a student, he went to France, in Paris in 1720, and bought not just this manuscript, but a number of manuscripts from a French noble family. And two of the volumes he gave to the college. But the tradition that he passed to the college with them is that they'd been commissioned for Francis I, the King of France and contemporary of Henry VIII, himself a great patron of the arts.
It's an enormously grand opening picture.
Here is the Garden of Eden and God viewing his creation, and yet there is a succession of stories. We see Eve being created from the rib of Adam here in the foreground, and God being surrounded by angels and animals. But also here Adam and Eve being tempted. So there is the serpent, unfortunately with a female head, tempting Eve, and she's then tempting Adam. And then, as one goes into the background, we see Adam and Eve being driven out of paradise by the angel, and then these two tiny black silhouettes are Cain and Abel. We have the figure of Cain raising his arm and slaying his brother Abel, all set in a beautiful French landscape. I mean, there's no inscription to say it belonged to the French royal family, but we have messages within here, because we have two animals which are intimately associated especially with one member of the French royal family, who was Claude of France, who was the wife of Francis I, and this is her personal symbol, the ermine, which is the stoat in its winter fur, and then just next to God the Father is a porcupine, and this was a symbol of the Duchy of Brittany. Now, her mother was Anne, Duchess of Brittany, and she was herself Duchess in her own right. So I think it's clear that this is an homage to the French royal court and to the French royal family.
It's been a very great privilege to be here looking at this wonderful manuscript. But it always strikes me as slightly sad, really, that this is a privilege granted to really very, very few people.
It's as fresh as it is because manuscripts like this are very sensitive to their environment, especially to light, and colours like this will fade if exposed to light. We don't have anywhere here in college that we could, even temporarily, put out on exhibition and let old members and visitors see. And so they do remain the preserve of scholars.
Here in the late Tudor library, today's students work surrounded by modern books arranged on presses that once contained chained books of the type that Julian has just shown us. The presses, or shelves themselves, are of great historical importance, and they are still serving their original purpose some 4 centuries on. Professor Richard Cowardine was at Corpus as an undergraduate in the 1960s and has returned as the 31st president of this college. He is an expert on Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, of whom he has written a notable biography. I asked him to choose one book from the library's collections, which for him held the greatest personal significance. So what have you got there to show us?
Well, what I've got here is a manuscript diary of one Thomas Crowder, an English gentleman who toured widely in the 19th century. One of his visits was to the United States during the American Civil War in 1863 and 4. And he brings to that visit the eye of an English gentleman, a certain de haut en bas, a certain superiority. From the moment he arrives, you get these wonderful insights into American life, and particularly, of course, his reactions, his British reactions to them. So you have this, on the American manners, the unpleasantness of American manners. Undoubtedly, he says, one must get accustomed to that ceaseless and too familiar squirting sound, which warns one to look out for saliva, and which renders every flaw bestial to an English eye.
These people chawing tobacco.
Absolutely.
Like Finn.
That's right, exactly.
Yes.
The quid of tobacco.
Yes.
But it's not simply about the manners of the Americans. It's actually about really substantive issues. There's another story here where he goes to the camp of Fighting Joe Hooker, which gives us an insight into slavery. The camps are full of contrabands. These are slaves that have come across the lines into the Union domain. I cannot help smiling, he says, when in the general's tent and waited on by 2 of these contrabands, to hear the manner in which he and others speak of the slaves as being of such undoubtedly inferior class of humanity. So you've got an army fighting to free the slaves, who nonetheless they regard as an inferior class of being.
Yes. There's a fascinating volume documenting American history. Presumably, if they've got, which God forbid there were a fire in the library, it would be one you would have to put in your pocket and run with.
Absolutely. It's a wonderful document. It tells you about an Englishman's view of America. He's such a brilliant observer that it also tells you a good deal about the Americans' view of the English. So were there to be a conflagration, and the 70,000 volumes were there exposed to this danger, this would be the book that I would seize above all others.
Forming a line with the library is the college's magnificent chapel. Fox's New Learning was not intended to supplant the teachings of the Church, but to allow for intellectual inquiry to flourish alongside orthodoxy. But the century after the foundation was to see great religious changes, and as Dr. Helen Moore, a fellow in English, explained to me, there is one particular work of English vernacular biblical studies which is very closely bound up with the history of this college.
This is a first edition of the King James Bible, published in 1611, and Corpus had a very particular connection with that translation through President John Reynolds up here. When King James came to the throne, he was faced with profound disagreements between the Bishop's party and the Puritan party, and he held a conference at Hampton Court, and John Reynolds was the leader of the Puritan party, put forward lots of proposals for reform, all of which were rebuffed, and then his final proposal was for a new translation of the Bible, and King James leapt on this idea with enthusiasm. It appealed to his own academic interests. And so Reynolds is the man who suggested to King James that this new translation of the Bible should be undertaken.
How did the translators organise their work?
This translation was the first translation of the Bible to take advantage of all of the work of scholarship that had been going on in Europe for the preceding 100 years. One very interesting aspect to the 1611 King James Bible are the preliminaries that were published along with it. We have the famous title page engraved by Cornelius Burl of Antwerp, showing the very common where here in the bottom right-hand corner as people turn the pages. Here we have the very famous map of Canaan, Speed's map of Canaan, showing sites of interest in the Holy Land, and with a real interest in the coastline as well, and also with a little sea monster sitting just there.
Oh, yes. And another one here.
Yes, indeed.
With the ship, St. Paul being about to be shipwrecked.
Absolutely. And of course, what this represents is that 17th century interest in the history of the Holy Land, a site of classical significance, Hebrew significance, and of course, overlaid on that for them, Christian significance as well. So here we have the places of the Old Testament and the New Testament all laid out.
Yes. It's been an extraordinary, moving experience to look at this book here, which in some ways was generated within Corpus, and also within yards of the bust of the man who, in a sense, put it all in motion.
Indeed, yes, this is a remarkable and magical place. In fact, the best time to come and see it, Paul, is maybe during the evening when maybe a choir is rehearsing, and especially in summertime, the sun is coming through the windows, and it's quite enchanting.
I have given you just a glimpse of the historical treasures that Corpus Christi has gathered in its library over the past 500 years. I have no doubt that this place will continue to be a source of utility and fascination for scholars and visitors for centuries to come.